ground forces are pinned here. We need air support diverted to this sector by 0800, regardless of the fog.
Yes, Major. I'll alert the squadrons immediately.
This sector here should be clear.
The auxiliary is primed, sir. She's running smooth.
All right, let's get this done.
Achtung! Schnell, fertig machen!
Wir müssen diesen Punkt hier angreifen.
Aber das Wetter dort ist zu schlecht. Wir nehmen diese Route.
Einverstanden. Beeilen wir uns.
January 1941. Dawn settles over a frozen Luftwaffe airfield in occupied Europe. The sky is low and metallic, pressed flat by winter cloud. Along the perimeter, rows of Messerschmitt fighters sit nose to wind, their canopies glazed with frost, their engines silent but waiting. The air smells of fuel and cold steel. Somewhere beyond the dispersal pens, a command tent stirs. Orders have already been issued. A squadron is scheduled to launch within the hour. Beneath one aircraft, a single mechanic works alone. His breath hangs in short white bursts as he tightens a cowling fastener and wipes oil from his gloves. He knows this engine by feel. The vibration patterns, the temperature tolerances, the sound it should make when everything is right. Something is not right. It is not dramatic. No alarms. No visible damage. Just a deviation measured in millimeters and minutes. An adjustment that could mean the difference between a clean climb and an engine seizure at altitude. Around him, pilots drink coffee and wait. Maps are folded. Timetables are precise. In the Luftwaffe, air power depends on punctuality. The mechanic pauses, then reaches for his tools. What he does next will keep an entire squadron on the ground and alter the course of a mission before the first engine ever starts. By the beginning of 1941, the Luftwaffe stood at a crossroads between reputation and reality. On paper, it remained one of the most formidable air forces in the world. In less than 2 years, German air power had crushed Poland, supported the rapid collapse of France, and carried the momentum of blitzkrieg across Europe. Aircraft had become instruments of tempo, tools not merely to destroy, but to paralyze. Speed was doctrine. Surprise was currency, and the engine was the heart of it all. Yet beneath the clean lines of official communiques and propaganda reels, the system was under strain. The Luftwaffe had not been built for a long war. Its structure assumed short, decisive campaigns fought close to home. Aircraft were designed for performance rather than longevity. Maintenance schedules were tight. Engines were pushed near their operational limits, especially during cold starts, rapid climb-outs, and repeated sorties. Every mission consumed not only fuel and ammunition, but metal, tolerance, and time. By late 1940, those margins were eroding. Germany's primary frontline fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the heavier Bf 110, relied on high-performance engines such as the Daimler-Benz DB601. These power plants were engineering achievements, fuel-injected, liquid-cooled, capable of sustained negative G maneuvers that gave German pilots a tactical edge. But they were also unforgiving. Minor deviations in valve timing, oil pressure, or coolant flow could cascade into catastrophic failure at altitude. In theory, Luftwaffe maintenance doctrine accounted for this. Each staffel was supported by a network of ground crews divided into specialties: airframe, armament, radio, and engine mechanics. The engine specialist, often trained for years before touching a frontline aircraft, carried a unique responsibility. He was expected to detect failure before it announced itself. In practice, the pressure was relentless. Operational demands rarely allowed full inspections. Aircraft returned from sorties still warm, still ticking as metal contracted, and were expected to be ready again by morning. Replacement parts were limited, especially at forward airfields. Cannibalization became common. One grounded aircraft could keep two others flying until it could not. Compounding this strain was geography. As the Luftwaffe expanded outward, its logistical tail stretched thinner. Airfields in occupied territory were often improvised. Frozen grass strips, converted civilian airports, hastily reinforced runways never designed for sustained combat operations. Winter made everything worse. Oil thickened, rubber hardened, metal fatigued faster. And still, the mission schedule did not slow. At the squadron level, readiness was measured in numbers. How many aircraft could be launched at first light? How many could be turned around before noon? Commanders were judged on sortie rates, not caution. A delayed takeoff was a failure. A grounded aircraft was an embarrassment. Within this environment, the mechanic occupied a paradoxical position. He held no rank of influence. He did not brief the pilots or choose the targets. Yet his hands decided whether an aircraft would climb, stall, or burn. His authority existed only in the moment of inspection, and even then, it could be overridden. Luftwaffe regulations were clear. An aircraft deemed unfit for flight by a certified mechanic was to be grounded. But unwritten pressures often spoke louder. The front demanded aircraft. Command demanded results. And pilots, waiting in the cold, trusted that the machine beneath them would hold together. It was in this narrow space, between doctrine and reality, between precision and urgency, that a single mechanical decision could halt an operation without firing a shot. And as the winter of 1941 deepened, those decisions became increasingly consequential. The broader war situation gave those mechanical decisions weight far beyond the hangar line. By early 1941, Germany's strategic horizon was widening and hardening at the same time. The Battle of Britain had ended without the decisive victory the Luftwaffe had promised. British cities had burned, but fighter commands still stood. Radar stations still turned. Runways were repaired overnight. The air war over the Channel had exposed a critical truth. Air superiority could not be improvised forever. At the same time, commitments multiplied. Aircraft and crews were being redeployed across a growing arc of operations, from the North Sea coast to the Balkans, from Norway to North Africa. Each theater demanded fighters for escort, reconnaissance, and interception. Each demanded reliability. The Luftwaffe's problem was no longer how to strike first, but how to be everywhere at once. Squadrons stationed in occupied Western Europe were tasked with a grinding operational tempo. Coastal patrols hunted British bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Fighter units scrambled repeatedly in response to radar contacts, many of them feints. Missions were often launched with minimal warning. Engines started cold, aircraft airborne within minutes. These rapid response alerts placed extraordinary stress on power plants, especially in winter. Fuel quality added another layer of risk. Germany's dependence on synthetic fuel, derived from coal hydrogenation, meant variability in performance. While adequate under ideal conditions, it reacted poorly to extreme cold and contamination. Engine knock, injector fouling, and uneven combustion were persistent concerns. For mechanics, this meant that an engine could pass inspection one day and fail the next without obvious external cause. Spare parts shortages compounded the issue. Priority flowed to new production and high-profile units. Frontline squadrons learned to make do. Worn components were adjusted rather than replaced. Tolerances were stretched. Maintenance logs grew longer and margins thinner. In this environment, the difference between serviceable and ready became ambiguous. Luftwaffe maintenance manuals specified precise operating parameters, oil pressure ranges, coolant temperatures, allowable vibration levels. But manuals assumed ideal conditions and complete resources. At forward airfields, judgment filled the gaps. A mechanic's experience became as important as the specification sheet. He listened. He felt. He compared today's engine to yesterday's memory. This was not romantic heroism. It was survival. Squadron commanders understood the risk, even if they rarely acknowledged it openly. An engine failure over friendly territory was an inconvenience. Over the channel or enemy lines, it was a death sentence. For fighters operating at low altitude, a seized engine offered seconds to react. For bombers or twin-engine aircraft, imbalance could tear the airframe apart. And yet, missions continued. Operational planning assumed losses. Aircraft were tools. Crews were resources. The system accepted attrition as the price of pressure. What it could not accept was disruption. Missed timings, broken formations, aborted strikes that handed initiative to the enemy. This made ground crews both indispensable and invisible. Their work rarely appeared in after-action reports. Success meant nothing happened. Failure meant investigation, blame, and sometimes court-martial. The safest path was silence and speed. Against this backdrop, a single mechanic's insistence on a small adjustment, one that delayed takeoff by minutes or grounded an aircraft entirely, carried disproportionate weight. He was not merely affecting one engine. He was interfering with synchronization, with formation integrity, with mission timing. And in a Luftwaffe squadron, timing was everything. The winter morning at that airfield was not unique. Thousands like it occurred across Europe. But on this one, the balance tipped, not through sabotage or enemy action, but through a deliberate act of technical restraint. The mechanic's choice would soon ripple outward, from engine cowling to operations board, from hangar floor to command staff, and from there into the air war itself. The story of that winter morning can be understood from several directions at once. each revealing a different pressure bearing down on the same quiet decision. Luftwaffe mechanics were not anonymous laborers pulled from factories and handed wrenches. Many were highly trained specialists, graduates of technical schools who had spent years learning tolerances measured in fractions and failures measured in lives. They rarely flew, but they understood flight intimately, how an engine breathed at altitude, how coolant behaved under sustained climb, how a misaligned component could vibrate itself into destruction. This mechanic had likely serviced dozens of engines identical to the one before him. He knew their quirks. He knew which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. More importantly, he knew when an engine was about to lie, when it would pass a brief test run and fail later at the worst possible moment. His responsibility was not to the schedule, but to physics. The Daimler-Benz DB601 was an advanced engine for its time, but demanded precision. Its fuel injection system relied on consistent pressure. Its cooling depended on unobstructed flow and careful thermostat regulation. In cold weather, oil viscosity could delay lubrication during startup, increasing wear in the first minutes of operation. A seemingly minor adjustment, retiming a valve, reseating a gasket, recalibrating an injector, could determine whether oil pressure stabilized or collapsed during climb. These were not dramatic repairs. They did not leave visible scars, but they required time. Time was the enemy. A Luftwaffe Squadron launched as a system. Aircraft took off in sequence, assembled into formations, and crossed into hostile airspace according to precise windows. One delayed aircraft could disrupt spacing. Two could force a reconfiguration. Several could abort the mission entirely. Fighter escorts that failed to arrive on time exposed bombers. Interceptors that launched late ceded altitude advantage. In air combat, minutes translated into meters and meters into lives. Thus, a grounded engine was not an isolated problem. It was a tactical fault line. Pilots trusted their machines because they had to. They strapped themselves into cockpits surrounded by fuel and ammunition, trusting that unseen hands had done their work correctly. Doubt, once introduced, was corrosive. An aircraft that felt unreliable was already dangerous. Mechanics knew this. They rarely explained details. They simply signed the logbook or refused to. Refusal was the sharpest tool they had. To ground an aircraft was to challenge the momentum of the entire operation. It was to assert that reality did not bend to orders. And in a military culture built on obedience and speed, that assertion carried risk. The mechanic beneath that fighter was not making a grandstand. He was making a calculation. He weighed the probability of failure against the certainty of delay. He measured consequence not in reprimands, but in fire and falling metal. His choice, though quiet, stood at the intersection of human judgment, mechanical limitation, and operational doctrine. And beyond the airfield fence, the enemy waited, unaware that a mission was already unraveling before it began. Luftwaffe command culture emphasized initiative in the air and obedience on the ground. Squadron commanders were under constant pressure to demonstrate readiness. Reports flowed upward daily. Numbers of aircraft available, numbers launched, numbers lost. A shortfall required explanation. An aborted mission demanded justification. Mechanics rarely appeared in those reports by name. Their work was absorbed into statistics. Yet their decisions directly affected those numbers. A commander could order a sortie. He could threaten discipline, but he could not rewrite metallurgy. Still, the expectation remained clear. Problems were to be solved quickly, not escalated. This created a subtle tension. Commanders relied on mechanics to keep aircraft flying, but also depended on them to remain invisible. The best maintenance decision, from a leadership perspective, was one that prevented failure without delaying the schedule. When that was impossible, conflict emerged quietly at first. Across the channel, British air defenses were improving. Radar coverage expanded. Fighter control refined interception timing. The RAF did not need to destroy every aircraft. It only needed to disrupt German coordination. Late arrivals, broken formations, and aborted missions were victories in themselves. Every Luftwaffe delay widened the window for interception or allowed bombers to turn back unchallenged. From the enemy's perspective, a grounded German squadron was indistinguishable from a defeated one. Thus, a mechanic's insistence on caution became an unintended act of denial, removing air power from the sky without firing a shot. He could have signed off the aircraft. He could have accepted the risk, trusting that the engine would hold together for one more mission. Many did. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they were not. To delay or ground an aircraft was not a neutral act. It shifted danger forward in time, away from the air and into the present moment. It forced confrontation with pilots eager to fly, with supervisors watching the clock, with a system that rewarded momentum. Yet the mechanic's obligation was not to morale or optics. It was to mechanical truth. In that sense, his decision was not heroic. It was professional. Modern air warfare depended on an illusion of seamless power. Engines starting on command, formations assembling on schedule, missions unfolding as planned. In reality, that illusion was maintained by constant, fragile effort on the ground. Every aircraft that flew did so because dozens of small decisions aligned correctly. When one of those decisions broke alignment, deliberately, cautiously, the system faltered. That winter morning, alignment failed at the lowest level, not through sabotage or incompetence, but through refusal to ignore a warning sign. The squadron's fate now hung on how that refusal would be received. And with engines soon scheduled to start, the moment for reconsideration was closing fast, drawing the story toward its turning point. The order to prepare for engine start came just after first light. Along the dispersal line, ground crews moved with rehearsed speed. Chocks were checked. Control surfaces tested. Pilots climbed into cockpits and fastened harnesses, their breath fogging inside enclosed canopies. Somewhere, a flare pistol was loaded to signal the launch sequence. Beneath one aircraft, the mechanic remained at work. During a brief test run earlier that morning, the engine had shown a subtle but persistent irregularity. Oil pressure stabilized slower than expected. Temperature rose unevenly across the cylinder banks. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger an immediate shutdown, but enough to suggest that under sustained climb, full power, high load, the margin would disappear. The DB601 could tolerate many abuses. It could not tolerate hesitation in lubrication. The mechanic had traced the issue to a component deep within the engine's oil circulation system, a pressure-regulating valve that responded sluggishly in the cold. The adjustment required partial disassembly, not a full teardown, but more than a quick fix. The clock was already against him. According to procedure, the aircraft should have been grounded immediately. According to operational reality, it was needed in the air. The mechanic knew how this conversation usually went. He also knew what happened to engines that lied convincingly enough to pass inspection. He made the decision alone. Tools came out. Panels were removed. The engine was opened just enough to access the valve. Oil drained into a shallow pan, thick and dark in the cold. His fingers moved quickly but carefully, adjusting clearances measured by feel more than instruments. There was no time for error. Around him, engines began to cough to life. The sound rolled across the airfield in waves, starter motors whining, cylinders catching, exhaust flaring blue-white against the frost. One by one, aircraft transitioned from silent shapes to living machines. Except one. The mechanic worked as if the noise did not exist. He reassembled the housing, reseated the gasket, and torqued the fasteners in sequence. Oil was replenished. Panels were secured. Only then did he signal for a test. When the engine finally turned over, it did so reluctantly at first. Then smoothly. Oil pressure rose, slowly, then steadily, into the acceptable range. Temperature stabilized across both banks. It was a good fix. It was also too late. The launch sequence had moved on. Formation timing was already compromised. The squadron commander, watching the clock, faced a decision of his own: delay the entire mission or launch without a full complement. The mechanic stood back, wiping his hands, knowing that the consequences of his choice were no longer his to control. The first aircraft began to taxi, and in that moment, the squadron's fate diverged from the plan drawn up the night before. The decision came quickly, and it came without ceremony. With one aircraft delayed beyond the launch window, the squadron commander ordered a partial takeoff. The formation would assemble without it. Timings were adjusted on the fly. Radio operators relayed changes. The mission would proceed, but reduced, lighter, less cohesive. From the airfield, the mechanic watched the fighters roll forward and lift into the gray morning sky, their silhouettes shrinking as they climbed into cloud. The engine he had worked on remained silent, propellers still, its pilot standing off to the side, helmet tucked under one arm. The effect of that absence unfolded beyond the horizon. Without a full complement, the formation's spacing shifted. Escort coverage thinned. Interception timing slipped by minutes. In air combat, minutes were decisive. British radar stations detected the incoming aircraft earlier than expected. Fighter controllers adjusted vectors. RAF fighters climbed to altitude with margin to spare. When contact was made, the German formation found itself at a disadvantage. Outnumbered in the critical first moments, forced to react rather than initiate. The engagement that followed was brief and fragmented. German pilots fought aggressively, as doctrine demanded, but cohesion was lacking. One aircraft took damage early and turned back. Another failed to rendezvous after a diving attack. The mission objective, whether escort, interception, or reconnaissance, was only partially achieved. Losses were not catastrophic, but they were unnecessary. When the surviving aircraft returned, fuel low and ammunition expended, the tone on the airfield was muted. Mechanics counted bullet holes. Armament crews safe weapons. Pilots filed reports that mentioned weather visibility, enemy numbers. No one mentioned the missing aircraft directly. Yet in the operations tent, the implications were clear. The sortie had failed to achieve its intended effect. Timings had slipped. The enemy had reacted faster than expected. Command would ask why. The delayed aircraft flew later that day, after the cold had eased and oil flowed more readily. Its engine performed without incident. The fix held. There was no celebration. The mechanic's decision had prevented a potential engine failure under combat load, an event that could have killed a pilot and scattered wreckage across enemy territory. It had also removed one aircraft from a critical moment in the air war, contributing to a mission that fell short of its goals. This was the paradox of technical restraint in wartime. Success was invisible. Failure was shared. By evening, the airfield returned to routine. Engines were serviced. Damage was repaired. New orders arrived. The war pressed on, but the squadron would remember that morning, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a subtle fracture in certainty. And from that fracture flowed consequences that extended well beyond a single flight line. In the days that followed, the consequences of that morning settled into paperwork rather than headlines. Luftwaffe after-action reports were clinical documents. They listed aircraft launched, enemy contacts, ammunition expended, damage sustained. They measured success in objectives reached and losses avoided. What they did not capture were the absences, the aircraft that never left the ground, the moments when a plan bent just enough to lose its edge. The squadron's mission was recorded as partially successful. One aircraft damaged, one pilot wounded, no aircraft lost outright. From a distance, it appeared acceptable. From closer inspection, it was a missed opportunity. Enemy aircraft had slipped through. Targets had not been engaged at the planned altitude or time. The formation had reacted rather than dictated. At higher command levels, the explanation was attributed to operational friction, weather, visibility, enemy response, familiar terms that absorbed failure without assigning blame. On the airfield, however, the memory was sharper. The pilot whose aircraft had been delayed flew the afternoon sortie without incident. His engine ran smoothly. He returned with no damage and no complaints. Quietly, he understood what the mechanic had prevented. Pilots had seen enough failures to recognize the signs afterward, the way an engine that should have failed instead held together. Among the ground crew, the incident became a reference point, not a story told loudly, but one recalled when similar choices arose. The oil pressure anomaly, the cold start, the delay that had rippled outward. It reinforced a lesson mechanics already knew but rarely had confirmed. Grounding an aircraft was sometimes the most dangerous decision and the most necessary. There was no commendation. Luftwaffe culture did not reward caution. Decorations went to pilots and commanders. Mechanics were expected to perform correctly, not heroically. Preventing disaster did not register unless disaster had first been visible. Yet the system adjusted, subtly. Maintenance inspections for that unit grew more conservative during extreme cold. Test runs were extended by minutes. Oil preheating procedures were enforced more strictly. None of this appeared in official doctrine immediately, but habits changed. The margin widened slightly. These adjustments had a cost. Sortie rates dipped during winter mornings. Commanders complained. Schedules were tightened elsewhere to compensate. The pressure never disappeared. It merely shifted. Strategically, the Luftwaffe continued to lose initiative. British defenses improved. German aircraft losses accumulated faster than replacements. Engine reliability remained a chronic concern, especially as the war expanded eastward later that year, where cold was harsher and distances longer. Within that larger decline, the event at the airfield was insignificant. And yet, for the men involved, it stood as a reminder of how close the system always was to failure, and how easily a single decision could expose that fragility. The question that lingered was not whether the mechanic had been right. It was how many similar decisions went unnoticed, both before and after, shaping the air war in ways no report could fully record. As the winter wore on, the Luftwaffe's reliance on its ground crews deepened, even as their visibility remained minimal. Operational tempo did not ease. Instead, it intensified. Aircraft were flown harder, longer, and more often. Engines accumulated hours faster than maintenance schedules anticipated. Cold weather failures increased. Emergency landings became routine enough to lose their shock. Each incident was investigated in isolation, rarely connected to the broader pattern. The squadron involved in that delayed mission was eventually redeployed. Airfields changed. Personnel rotated. The mechanic moved on to other aircraft, other engines, other mornings where the same calculation had to be made again under different conditions. There was no formal acknowledgement of what had been prevented. Luftwaffe records, where they survive, show no annotation that a catastrophic engine failure had been avoided that day. History only records what happened, not what almost did. Yet patterns emerge across the Air Force. By mid-war, German aircraft availability declined sharply, not solely because of combat losses, but because of maintenance exhaustion. Engines reached the end of their service life sooner. Shortcuts taken in 1940 and 1941 came due in 1942 and 1943. The system that had relied on speed over sustainability began to consume itself. Mechanics were increasingly placed in impossible positions, expected to maintain performance with diminishing resources. Their judgments became even more consequential. A single aircraft grounded could mean the difference between escort coverage and vulnerability. A single engine pushed beyond its limits could remove a trained pilot permanently from the war. In retrospect, the winter morning when one mechanic delayed a squadron's launch fits into this broader narrative of attrition by detail. The Luftwaffe did not lose the air war in one battle or one campaign. It lost in thousands of small moments where reality refused to align with doctrine. Fuel quality, spare parts, training pipelines, engine wear, and decisions made on frozen airfields before dawn. The Allied advantage grew not just from numbers, but from resilience, systems designed to absorb failure and recover. German air power, by contrast, remained brittle, brilliant when conditions were ideal, vulnerable when they were not. The mechanic's engine fix did not change the outcome of the war. It did not even alter the trajectory of the campaign in any measurable way. What it did was reveal the hidden mechanics of defeat, the way large outcomes are shaped by small constraints. By the time the Luftwaffe faced overwhelming Allied air superiority, the lesson was already written in countless maintenance logs and unspoken choices. The war would continue to accelerate beyond the capacity of individual judgment to contain it. And in that acceleration, The quiet authority of the mechanic, once capable of halting a squadron, would be gradually drowned out by necessity, leaving only fragments of decisions like his scattered through the record, waiting to be noticed. War is often remembered in grand gestures, sweeping offensives, decisive battles, brilliant maneuvers. Yet history is also shaped by what is quiet, technical, and unseen. The engine that refused to start on a frozen morning, the hand that adjusted a valve, the decision to delay rather than risk collapse. These are acts without fanfare, yet they ripple outward with consequences that the eye rarely tracks. The mechanic's intervention highlights a truth that transcends any single conflict. Technology is only as reliable as the human judgment that maintains it. Machines may dominate the battlefield, but they do not act alone. Precision, patience, and care often determine whether a system succeeds or fails. One small choice, a measured hesitation, a moment of attention can prevent disaster or, conversely, allow it to unfold. In the context of the Luftwaffe, this quiet work revealed both strength and fragility. German aircraft were marvels of engineering, capable of extraordinary feats. Yet their reliance on fragile engines, on exact tolerances, on human skill under pressure, created vulnerabilities invisible to strategy and statistics alike. The difference between victory and defeat, survival and catastrophe, was sometimes measured not in bombs or bullets, but in oil pressure, valve timing, and the careful eye of a single mechanic. This story also reminds us that heroism in war is not always dramatic. It does not always appear in history books or propaganda reels. Often, it is expressed in restraint, in professionalism, and in the courage to act according to knowledge rather than orders. The mechanic's quiet intervention preserved life, a formation, and perhaps a mission, even while leaving no trace in the official narrative. In the end, the frozen morning, the grounded aircraft, and the adjusted engines stand as a testament to the unseen human labor behind every weapon, every strategy, and every sortie. They reveal that while warfare measures destruction, its history is composed of countless small acts of care, judgment, and diligence. Moments where the future is decided in silence, by hands that make sure the machine works before it can carry men into battle. And it is in those moments, often overlooked, that history quietly pivots.